Okay, so we have a new episode of Legends and Leaders, and today it's great to have Jordan here. Jordan, you're somebody that has been really innovative in a lot of different areas. You started out being into the space of rockets and looking towards what you can do that's kind of beyond Earth, with and help create Relativity Space, and was the CTO for quite some time, building it up to a company that I think achieved a $4.2 billion valuation as of recently. But you were instrumental in creating the technical processes that laid the foundation for what it's become today. Now you're working. You have your own VC fund. You're focusing on deep tech investments over there, and you're also focusing on changing the way that hardware is being created, hardware tools are being created, and laying the infrastructure for that to be much more modernized. So I'm excited to have you here and to get into your story.
Excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So where did your passion for like entrepreneurship and technology and business, like where did this kind of begin? Was it something you had when you were young? How did this start?
Growing up, I think I always enjoyed the tinkering of making things. There's something really satisfying about that. And I think that extended into my professional career, even my college career, and where there's almost like an addicting feeling of making a tool, making something that scales and grows and works well on its own. Whether that tool is, making a machine or making a company, or even now, making a fund that invests in companies that are of a style that I like. And so I can't really pinpoint it on any one thing other than I find it really enjoyable and satisfying to build things, and have extended that for the last decade or so.
Mhm. Did you have like any businesses when you were young that you were doing or things like that?
No, I spent most of my kind of early years, I worked on a truck with my dad. We spent a lot of time working on cars, a lot of time building Legos, a lot of time, eventually playing computer games. But then in kind of my middle years growing up. But I do think a lot of it started on my entrepreneurial path when I was in college. I ran USC's Rocket Propulsion Lab, which is a student group trying to be the first student group to fly a rocket to space. And that just to me was this very exciting self-set goal. I think that's what really made it stand out for me is you see a lot of other student groups that, they're flying a rocket to a mile high to land an egg on a parachute, kind of the same classic NASA competition, which is respectable in its own right. But you're following someone else's goal. Someone else set that target for you. And my first week of college, the Rocket Lab came in, the first Friday of class and was trying to recruit students to work on the rocket they were building. And there was just something kind of magical of setting your own goal, which for them was flying the first student-built rocket to space. Then setting that goal, doing whatever it takes to get there, without that being someone else's dream that you're achieving or someone else's target. And that, I think, set a foundation for the rest of my career.
Mhm. So how did your passion for like space begin? I mean, you mentioned in college you got involved, but like what prompted you to want to be involved in space?
Yeah, I originally went to school, aerospace engineer, thinking I'd work on planes. Admittedly, I hadn't thought much on the rocket side or what like a career in rocketry would look like. Everyone always asks like you'd have some, kind of predestined plan for what you were going to work on and how it was going to play out. But I don't know, and I think you'll see between, going into the space side kind of fairly haphazardly or the rest of my career, that wasn't some pre-baked plan. It was just working on really what I found enjoyable. I had a lot of passion for, as well as I think came out in due time, talent for it as well. And that until that first Friday of school I mentioned when that Rocket Lab came in, they had this really cool, the first rocket they flew, it's this 12-foot long, 6-inch diameter carbon fiber rocket that they made. I'd never thought of working on rockets. For 5 days in school, thought I was going to work on planes the rest of my career. And the moment that I think it was really the excitement around the rocketry, because it's at so much of kind of the engineering fringe of what's possible on performance, on even capitalizing the companies to achieve the goals they want to achieve. That there's something much more exciting about that than the airplane side, the aviation side. So I lasted 5 days as an aerospace engineer wanting to work on planes, and rest is history now.
So how did you wind up meeting your co-founder and like coming up with this idea for a relativity space?
Yeah, it's a funny story. Me and Tim actually met. All things converged on that first Friday of school. There it was a very kind of happen chance a day. But first meeting of that student group, Tim was there. Tim's still CEO of Relativity today. Then he was one of the upperclassmen. I want to say he was a junior, a couple years ahead of me, that was helping run the lab. Then, and I remember him showing me some of the aerospace simulations. He'd written the 6 Degree of Freedom Monte Carlo simulations that show the dispersion of how the rocket will perform during flight. He was showing me preliminary versions of those he'd written. And we'd stayed friends. I eventually ran that lab my junior and senior year of college. He was one of the students, in that lab. I helped him get his grad school funding. And then we parted ways. He went to Blue Origin up in Seattle, which is Jeff Bezos' space company. I went to SpaceX when I graduated. And did we know we were going to start a company together? No. Did we have like a plan to talk about that? No. It's kind of the comical nature of how this stuff comes together. But I had some realization when I signed full-time at SpaceX. I was originally going to sign a lease with a couple of the other interns that were converting to full-time. I got cold feet. It would have been Manhattan Beach, close to SpaceX headquarters. So I moved back in with my parents in Pasadena. And, the one, caveat of that was that, there was an hour commute across downtown LA, to SpaceX and back. So I started doing, as kind of my first foray into adult commuting life, calling people while driving, pass the time. And Tim was one of the people I called, and we shared stories on things we saw in industry that were working, things that we saw that weren't working. And that led us down a path to talk about, why are people not wanting to adopt 3D printing at scale? We both were working on 3D printed projects at each of our respective jobs, and eventually settled that there was opportunity. We thought we were onto something. And again, though, we didn't set out to have that conversation, but it's a happen chance of me not wanting to live in Manhattan Beach and having a couple hours each day in the car to talk to people.
Mm-hmm. So you guys kind of have this idea that could become a business. How did you think, Jordan, you were going to go and raise the money to get this off the ground and help you go full time with it? What was your plan? And I know you guys had that Mark Cuban email that he responded and helped you guys out with, but what was the kind of plan at that point?
Yeah, that Mark Cuban email has gotten some notoriety, at this point, which is great to see kind of, 8 years later. But I think we did what I would recommend anyone do, setting out to do something new, is we Googled, how to get venture capital. Then we're both, engineers, self-trained in the business side, the finance side, the legal side. And neither of us had ran a business. At least for me, I hadn't prior to that thought that I would run a business at some point. So you Google how to get venture capital, and top 2 results are Y Combinator, which is kind of the top incubator in Silicon Valley. So we applied to that, not really realizing at the time how exclusive or kind of famous, of an incubator it was. And then the second thing was emailing Mark Cuban. His email is fairly public. He tends to respond very quickly as well. And we got yeses from both. And I think that was obviously a very lucky and somewhat misleading first experience of what fundraising looks like. We're like, oh, this is easy. You ask 2 people for money, they give it to you. And that was back in 2015. I was 22 years old at the time. So really had no idea what I was getting into professionally and what it looked like to run a company. But that said, we found fundraising sources by reaching out, doing our own research, and a lot of work. And we've distilled this over the years as well, really refining what we did, why it was important in a way that was received, very quickly by people who generally have fairly limited time to review stuff like that.
So how impactful was Mark to the business? Was he just a capital partner? Did he also provide a lot of advice? How impactful was he overall?
Impactful for sure. Starting on the financial side, along with even his questions for diligence. He was the first kind of outside person we talked to at depth about the company. And it goes into that question, Mark isn't known as a space investor. He's not known as someone known for aerospace tech development. And so us having the ability to explain this extremely complex story of, why does 3D printing rockets and building the world's largest metal 3D printers, why does that make sense? How are you going to capitalize that further? How are you going to hit milestones that make sense? You have to explain that. And it's where a lot of founders sometimes dither. Then is that the more people you can explain that to succinctly, the more people you can win over, whether it's capital partners or otherwise. And, often founders, they sometimes struggle with telling their own story because it makes so much sense to them. How do you explain it to someone that's never done a space investment before, never looked at a space company before? And the rule of thumb was like, could you explain it to your grandmother and have her understand why it makes sense? And that's often for people, quite a challenge for almost any company. It's a tricky challenge. So we really distilled that down. That was probably what Mark's input and feedback was the most beneficial on, was having that first opportunity to explain that, again, to someone who was not familiar. It's very different to explain something to, someone who had built a space company before versus someone who had never looked at a space company before. And Mark's definitely, in the category that had not built anything, or even necessarily looked at it prior.
So Jordan, you were this young guy at the time. You got the opportunity to get some funding to get this started, right? And you were the technical person. So how did you kind of go about creating this new type of 3D printer and the 3D printing technology, and to create something that's viable in this space when it wasn't really done before? Like, how did you kind of start that?
Yeah, it's a combination really on judgment calls of understanding when do you know enough to go try something. And try it with real hardware, because that's where the expense starts. You can read and study and look at what other people had done. But at least in our sector, there have been people that have built big printers before. And the challenge is that those big printers never got adoption. And when I say big, I say kind of bigger than a couple square feet in footprint. Yeah. So we had really looked at those printers, those business models, and seen, what worked technically, what didn't work technically, what did people want to adopt, what didn't they, and kind of why. And we built in the first, couple of weeks of the company, this is back in kind of December of 2015, then a kind of a trade space of how to architect a printer. And then came the question of starting to get, a warehouse to build that printer in, starting to get robotics. Which robotics do you get? Can you control those robotics well enough? Can you integrate stuff into them? And you reach generally kind of that 80-20 inflection point where you know enough by just reading and creating models and trade studies that you need to throw hardware at the problem. And that's when the real kind of fun begins. And because there's so much you have to learn in the field, trying it, iterating on the printers, iterating on the tech, dealing with the supply chain, and seeing what actually kind of makes sense in reality. But I think it's a combination. At least I came from a background. I built some automated machinery back in that USC lab. I knew enough to be dangerous on a rocket design side. And then all the other aspects on the robotics, the software, the machine learning that went into the printers. I knew enough to get those off the ground. And then you see a lot of startups that, their rule of thumb is, and I like following it as well, is, learn enough that you can hire someone smarter than you. And we eventually did that, growing that. By the time we had our first full size printer, the company was about 14 people.
So once you built a printer and people really saw what was possible, did you expect the kind of traction that you guys would get was what you guys were going to have? Because people were really impressed by, wow, you can build something like this. It really looks like it can be a real rocket. Is that what you were kind of expecting?
I think we went in with high hopes. It's one of the benefits of, starting a company so early and with such a limited external experience. It's a good thing and a bad thing, at times. And is that you don't know what you don't know. And you see founders where you almost go in with such a woeful optimism that carries you through what is the actual difficulty. If you actually know how difficult it's going to be, will you go and do it, on day one? Then having that naivety is very helpful. So that said, we did have a pretty strong vision, and we tried to baseline it as far as why are the printers helpful, and summarizing that it makes it so you can make things cheaper and faster. And it's that question of, does anyone want something? Bezos references this a ton with regards to kind of Amazon's model. Then will any customer ever complain that something is done cheaper and faster? And so that applied into the rocketry world. We viewed the printers as the source for that happening. And as long as we built those printers that would align with customer expectations and desires, and that would convert into investor interest, customer interest, and further growth of the company.
Mm-hmm. So you had a lot of experience at Relativity and doing, being really unconventional. Why did you decide, Jordan, that it was time for the chapter to kind of close and to do something else?
So I was chief technology officer for the first 5 years of the company, kind of December 2015 till end of 2020. And in that period, the company grew from, just the two of us in a WeWork, in Seattle to then, a couple hundred people, in an 800,000 square foot facility in Los Angeles. then 7 offices across the US here. And that for me was an amazing journey. If you asked me on day one, I would have said I would retire at Relativity as like a 90-year-old graybeard. And what else would I want to do? And it's something that, to bring it back to that kind of tool making analogy, Relativity was getting to a size that, there was someone very senior in every position. There was very little that I needed to be the expert on other than, kind of some high level steering and judgment, but I'd felt that I'd baked that into the culture in a way through hiring and obviously cultivating the team there for half a decade. And it was very different. It was kind of that soul searching you have as the company gets bigger is like, do you want to go back to day one from scratch, or do you want to grow something from, a couple hundred people to what the company is now, which is around 1,200, full-time staff. And that scaling from 300 people to 1,200, it just didn't excite me in the same way. And there were people that were in various spots of the company that absolutely thrive in that level of growth. They love that day to day. For me, I was starting to grow a distaste for it and would rather start from scratch.
So you could have, at that point, you wanted to start from scratch. You could create your own business. You could help a bunch of other people create their own businesses. Seems like you kind of decided to do both, and be in the venture capital space and launch something new. Why did you decide to have this type of approach, and how has it been in terms of doing investments? Like, how have you enjoyed that process?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can definitely say when I stepped out of Relativity, I didn't know what I wanted to do next. What ended up happening was myself and then Jenna Bryant, who is a partner at another fund here in Los Angeles. She was starting a new fund, a new firm called Embedded Ventures, and asked me to come on as a technical advisor to help diligence companies, look at companies. Then that was right around the same time that I was leaving Relativity. So it made sense to me in a way of, I've always liked working with the next generation, whether they're students, founders. There's so many people that helped me, when I was in those kind of early days. I like doing the same, make sure new kind of entrants have the same opportunity that I did. And but for me, it was something that I came to really start enjoying over a couple months, spending time with founders, helping support them, back them, mentor them. That eventually Jenna asked if I wanted to come on as a full-time co-founder and GP, general partner, for the fund. And I ended up saying yes, for the reason that I really enjoyed kind of the creative time alongside, day one founders. Then you're helping, build from, but more like a distance. And after about a year of that, so fast forward to kind of mid 2021, and I was missing some of what I call being in the hot seat. Then, as when I'm on boards, when, we're a major investor, like also box to our founders as much as they want me to, and then generally a little bit more, and hopefully something I say is valuable for them. But when it comes to making the decisions, they're the founder's decision to make, the management team's decision to make. And I'm not there as a board member to make decisions. I'm there for kind of accountability and long-term steering. And so when it came to that, I was missing what is, I'd say, the very stressful part of growing a company, but also the very satisfying part. Then where you make those difficult decisions, get through those very, what is messy operational moments. I definitely say, operating as a venture capital fund is, quite a bit easier than operating a startup. Then it has its own challenges, but the day-to-day stresses are quite different. And so we got in a position where we started incubating companies, and I became a kind of an incubating executive, at those. The first one of which is a company called Zoo. It was originally called Kitty Cat when we spun it out. And I was CEO there for about a year and a half, and then promoted one of the other co-founders to CEO, and I now run the company as executive chairman.
So what do you aspire to accomplish now with Zoo? Because you're trying to take a different approach to creation of hardware. Like, what do you see that's missing in the market, and what are some of your goals for Zoo?
Great question. The primary thing we set out to do was build a bridge between all the advancement you see today in the machine learning world and hardware design. You see improvements in audio generation, video generation, media of every format, then from AI, other than hardware design. Hardware design has, I'd argue, never had any machine learning entrance in there. There's some stuff that people say is machine learning, but it's not. And it's much more kind of logic based. It's not an actual trained model. And that's a very missing bridge. So that was one of the areas that for me, we had a digital engineering sector of our fund We were looking at companies trying to find someone that wasn't just making like a small incremental change to the industry. There's plenty of companies doing that right now, some that are doing it really well. But we wanted to see the industry move completely forward. How do you end up with autonomous hardware design? How do you automatically send a piece of the hardware design to a factory to be made autonomously? Then there's a huge amount of software infrastructure missing there that prevents that from happening. And if you had that world where you could, let's say, unlock the hardware engineer as more of a creative force, then someone who is spending their entire day clicking on the screen with a mouse to draw every line, every circle, every feature. I still have carpal tunnel to this day from being a designer for so long. Then why is that the paradigm? So we kind of broke that down, and eventually myself and then one of the other fund advisors at Embedded, her name was Jess Frizzell. Then we decided that made sense for our first incubated project, was building, this bridge between the ML world and the hardware design world. And where essentially sky's the limit on top of that. Think like what ChatGPT does, especially OpenAI's API, where you can build extensible products on top of the OpenAI infrastructure. We wanted that for hardware design. And that started with building, which we launched last year, the world's first GPU-enabled, cloud-hosted, API-accessible graphics engine. It's the first graphics engine that's launched in about 20 or 30 years that's been built from scratch. And we found that as the first necessary step to build that AI for hardware development kind of approach.
What are some of like the overall areas, Jordan, that you're looking at in deep tech? Like you mentioned, what you're focusing on now, trying to change the way hardware is created and applying AI to that. But overall in deep tech, like what are some of the other areas that you think have the most amount of promise?
Yeah, we'll start with my kind of bread and butter, which is the space tech side. The way we built the space tech part of our portfolio is really what happens as launch costs come down. Everyone sees, Falcon 9 flying, every like 2 or 3 days. Now it's really amazing. We see Starship entering the market. We see other entrants entering the market as well. And where launch costs are coming down. But what happens next? You see SpaceX with some of their applications, but then, even today there was an announcement on further NASA funding for lunar opportunities. And where, the moon, from our perspective, has been next on a commercialization and industrialization perspective. There's applications for space tech that never would have made sense before, whether economically or just kind of rate of progress in other technical areas. There's a lot of disruption happening in those areas as costs come down, new entrants are enabled, incumbents move, kind of too slow. And so we have about a third of our portfolio focused on that space infrastructure, kind of space application side. And then we like synergizing the portfolio in a way that targets that space tech area and without fully overlapping in focus. And what I mean by that is a third of the portfolio is advanced manufacturing. A third of the portfolio is digital engineering, so software for hardware design, and that's where Zoo lives. And where if you're making the world's most advanced hardware, it tends to be space tech, or often is space tech, not always. And that you want the world's most advanced manufacturing, and you want the world's most advanced design tools. So that allows us on a portfolio construction side to have 3 very synergetic areas. Those happen to be the 3 areas that I've also worked on the majority of my career, which helps us on kind of diligence and access. And synergy within the portfolio, where there's a good amount of cross-portfolio kind of partnerships that happen, and without solely concentrating on the space tech side. And that was a request from some of our investors and backers that they've seen a lot of space portfolios, solely space tech, solely dependent on one launch vehicle, solely dependent on certain geopolitical conditions. There's a lot of consolidated risk there from a portfolio kind of management perspective that we de-risk by having significant kind of terrestrial exposure from the advanced manufacturing and digital engineering side of the fund.
Mm-hmm. So Jordan, what do you hope to accomplish? And this is the last question I have. Like, what do you hope to accomplish at this phase in your life? I mean, you've done a ton in the space side. You're now identifying a lot of new areas to invest in. You've got a company that you're running with Zoo. You've got a fund that you're running with Embedded. Like, what do you think you haven't done yet that you want to be able to achieve now?
Oh, there's plenty. Then I have had a very lucky kind of career and rate of progress that we've had so far. But the things that I want to work on, I want Zoo to be underneath every hardware design tool and company in the world. Then I think there's a huge limitation, both in bandwidth and cost drivers because of design workflows and then converting design into kind of manufacturing, supply chain, instruction. And that's just kind of a silly, archaic industry. And you see lots of people building companies in a direction that is, half a step forwards from the current versions. And those current versions are, rooted in 1970s tech. And most of the companies being built in the sector, I think, are kind of should be ashamed that there's such a small step forward in what they're proposing. But maybe that's because the industry is like so far behind. And so we want to be underneath every company out there. We want to turn Embedded Ventures, which is our fund, into a generational fund. It takes quite a long time to get a fund off the ground. I have to often remind ourselves that, our current fund is the size of, Founders Fund's first fund and Andreessen's first fund, and where you see them in the news, every day, but they're, 20-year-old vehicles, at this point. And so that said, we're constantly growing our fund, kind of our companies, our long-term track record, and would want to turn that into something that is its own kind of like generational entity that's known. And then we want to keep incubating companies. I've used the fund with First Zoo, and now we have a second incubated company in work as kind of an extension for the ideas that I want to see. And when we see those and someone else is working on them in a way that we find that we're fans, obviously we'll invest. Then if we see an idea for a company or think of an idea for a company and don't see anyone working on it, then we'll spin that out. Then we have a second incubated company coming on its way. That'll be out of stealth by kind of end of the year or so. And but that said, do I have one overarching goal at this time? I'd say no. I like building things. I like building ideas that are in my head, into companies. And then it takes a while to refine them to the level that they don't get kicked out for being bad. And occasionally they stick. And but no, I like building things, and I'm gonna keep on doing that, and building new ways to build them as well.
Awesome. Well, Jordan, I appreciate you coming on, and I'm definitely excited to see what you'll continue to create. I think that Zoo's got a lot of opportunity, and you're solving a great problem that needs to be solved. And I'm sure that what you'll create with Embedded and how you'll scale the fund and the other companies that you incubate out, especially this new one that you mentioned, I'm sure they'll have a lot of success, and people should definitely check out what you're doing at Zoo. So thanks for coming on.
Of course. Thank you for having me.